In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. presented the Ware Lecture at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly down in Hollywood, Florida. In his lecture, titled "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution," King recounts the story of Rip Van Winkle, particularly how when he went up the mountain, the sign on the inn had a picture of King George III. And when he came back down, the same inn had a picture of George Washington. King reminds us that Rip Van Winkle slept through a revolution. He says, "One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change, and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. And there can be no gainsaying of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our world today. We see it in other nations in the demise of colonialism. We see it in our own nation in the struggle against racial segregation and discrimination. And as we notice this struggle, we are aware of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our midst." He continues by saying, "The idea whose time has come today is the idea of freedom and human dignity. And so all over the world, we see something of freedom explosion. And this reveals to us that we are in the midst of revolutionary times. An older order is passing away and a new order is coming into being." He presented these words in 1966 to a large gathered body of Unitarian Universalists. 1966. And the words of his lecture could easily be given today. For sadly, for what strides we have made in this country, we have also not done enough. The question that King asks in his lecture is one that can be asked today. What do we do when we find ourselves in such a period? Indeed, what do we do? King believed that the church is the moral guardian of the community and society, that our role has always been to, quote, broaden horizons, to challenge the status quo, and to question and break mores if necessary. That's a big role to fill, and I believe it is one we can fill. Much like in 1966, I believe we are in a position to leverage that role to create major social change. It requires courage. It requires answering the call to be that moral guardian. It requires remaining awake through the revolution. King had advice for the church, and perhaps specifically for us as Unitarian Universalists in his lecture. Advice on how to stay awake through the revolution. And I wonder if we're there, if we've done the things he challenged us to do, if we're courageous enough to continue to do the things he challenged us to do. The first of these things is to instill a world perspective. In 1966, this was a newer concept. Technology then had, in the words of King, made this world a neighborhood. He saw that we were connected one to another. What happens across the world affects us. If not now, it will. And do we not see this now? Climate change, destabilization of governments, poverty, war, natural disasters, a global pandemic. What happens to one happens to us all. We must see each other as connected. All are a part of the human family. And we are now closer to one another than ever before. Technology today has brought us even closer than we were in 1966. In a moment, in a heartbeat, we can connect to someone across the world through the internet, bringing them literally into our living room where we can see and hear them. If that doesn't illustrate the interconnected web of which we are all a part, I don't know what does. King said, quote, "Life is interrelated, and somehow we are all tied together. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be." Until we have the moral courage to say that about all of our human family, we will never be what we ought to be. And that means everyone. The ones that don't look like us, the ones that don't talk like us, the ones that don't believe like us. We are all connected and we need one another. This leads into the second thing King says is necessary for the church to stay awake. He says, quote, "It is necessary for the church to reaffirm over and over again the essential immorality of racial segregation." It was true in 1966, and sadly, it is true today. We are still seeing the effects of white supremacy in our culture. It's not new. It's not the past. It is current and systemic and pervasive, and it is our job to shine a light on it and work to eradicate it, to rise up and say that it is wrong and must stop, not only on the large stages as a whole movement, but also in those smaller moments, the one-on-one conversations when someone makes a racist statement. It means speaking up. It means leveraging any privilege we have to help those who are oppressed in big ways and small ways. It means listening when our marginalized siblings in our human family say that they are hurt. It means not judging, not arguing, but listening. And if we are the ones who have caused the pain, regardless of the intention, to own the impact. It means following their lead when it comes to justice initiatives. It means not expecting them to teach those of us who are in privileged groups about their own oppression and marginalization. We must reaffirm over and over again the immorality of segregation and racial injustice. This leads to the third thing that King says the church needs to do to stay awake. He says, "I think it is necessary to refute the idea that there are superior and inferior races. We must get rid of the notion once and for all that there are superior and inferior races. It is out of this notion that the whole doctrine of white supremacy came into being, and the church must take a stand through religious education and other channels to direct the popular mind at this point, for there are still some people who still believe this strange doctrine." We still see this today. There are children at our border who have been separated from their parents, who are here to seek asylum from dangers and threats we cannot even imagine. There are those in our country and in our government who would have us believe that those families, those children, are subhuman because they do not look like they do. There are those who will say that they can be treated as subhuman because they are inferior. There are children and families in Flint, Michigan, who have been without clean, safe drinking water since 2014. And I wonder if that would still be happening if the families there were not poor and Black. There are those who believe that Black and brown bodies can be shot down with impunity simply because they exist. We must constantly refute the idea that there are superior and inferior races. This is our role as moral guardians. Finally, King calls for the church to move into the arena of social action. He says, quote, "It is not enough for the church to work in the ideological realm and to clear up misguided ideas. To remain awake through this social revolution, the church must engage in strong action programs to get rid of the last vestiges of segregation and discrimination. Not just out protesting, although there is room and space for that. We need to be fighting this revolution on all fronts: letter writing, phone calls, voting, protests, and supporting those programs that are working to change this culture." Now that's the tricky part, and something that we sometimes do not always do well. Oh, we look like we do. But we must remember that those of us with privilege need to listen to those who are oppressed and marginalized. We need to find out what they need for us to do to support the work. And then we need to do it. Not to come in and think we know more and can do better. We need to listen and to help as they need us to help. And that will likely mean taking a back seat and not being in front and visible. And that's sometimes hard for us as UUs. And that's the crux of the situation. If we are going to stay awake during this revolution, we need to really take in King's words. Sure, we as a denomination heard them in 1966, but did we take them in? Did we really? Have we stayed awake during the revolution? Are we awake now? The revolution is hard, my friends. We may need times to rest to fight another day, but we cannot fall asleep. We are called to be moral guardians. We must stay awake. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. finished his Ware lecture with the following. But I must say to you this evening, my friends, there are some things in our nation and in our world to which I am proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon you to be maladjusted and all people of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to become adjusted to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities away from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of people perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of prosperity. I must honestly say, however much criticism it brings, that I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and to the self-defeating effects of physical violence. My friends, we must stay maladjusted. The road will not be easy. Revolutions rarely are. And make no mistake, we are in the midst of a revolution. Again, still. But if we can stay awake, we can make change. In closing, I want to share the words of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. from his speech, Where Do We Go From Here, in 1967. And I must confess, my friends, that the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will still be rocky places of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will be inevitable setbacks here and there, and there will be those moments when the buoyancy of hope will be transformed into the fatigue of despair. But difficult and painful as it is, we must walk on in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. I have faith in us. I have faith that we will not only stay awake, but we will also help to lead this revolution. I have faith that we will stay maladjusted to the ills of this world. Amen. Blessed be, and may it be so.